Hello! Your WordPress website can load really slowly if you have too many files loading at the same time when someone visits your site. In this video, I'm going to show you how to join those files together and compress them, kind of smush them all together so that your WordPress site loads faster. But before we get into the technical details, I wanted to give a quick demonstration with some Play-Doh that will hopefully explain the whole problem and the solution all in one go. So over here we have your website visitors, and this tube represents the internet. And I'm going to play the role of your web server in this little demonstration. Each of these little balls of Play-Doh is a file on your site that needs to get down to the end user here. So this might be a CSS file, maybe a JavaScript. And what your server needs to do is send these files one at a time down the internet, there when it came out on the other side, to the end user. Now, realistically, your server is going to send a few of these at a time, but the point is that it's limited in how quickly or how many files that it can send down the internet. So you can see how this might be a problem because, it has to send one down and say, hey, did you get it? Okay, cool, I'm ready to send the next one. So this is the problem with having whole bunches of files on your site. And your site might look something like this, where you've installed a whole bunch of plugins, your theme is kind of like grown over time, and all of these individual files are really useful to your site, but we're going to face some problems here sending these down one at a time, and this is where the bottleneck starts to happen. It looks like we have some internet blockage here. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, the answer is in concatenation and minification. So let's talk about concatenation first. Concatenation in this case is taking some of these files and just smushing them together, putting them all together end to end into one gigantic file. So on your particular site, you might have your CSS files right here and your JavaScript files right here. So we just concatenated all the files on your site. Now, we can talk about minification. So minification is taking these files and trimming them down to the smallest possible size that they can be. So we're going to go ahead and trim the CSS down a little bit. And we're going to shape them for the internet here. So now, after we've concatenated and minified the files on your site, we have the smallest possible single files that we can send down to the end user. So now instead of sending 20 different files, we just drop each one down there and it goes through. That actually worked. If you've ever used a diagnostic tool on your site to try to figure out what was going on, you've probably seen a chart like this. And all this is a waterfall chart. From left to right, it's time. And from top down, it shows us each of the files that are loaded up in the reader's browser when they try to visit our site. And you'll see on this particular site, I have a lot of different style sheets loaded up. And you'll see that over the course of time, they're loaded up incrementally, not all at once. And this is the root of our problem. Most browsers have a limit on the number of files that they'll download from your particular server, from your web host, at one time. I'm using Chrome here, Google Chrome, and it only allows me to download 6 files at a time from any individual website. So you'll see here in the waterfall that these style sheets down here don't start loading until 2 seconds into the page load. Up here I see 2 seconds. So Chrome does not allow more style sheets to be loaded until the original ones have finished up here. So you can see where this could be a problem when you have lots and lots of style sheets or JavaScript on a page. They take a long time to load because they can only load a few at a time. Notice how the load time for this page is over 8 seconds. So what can we do about all these files on our site? The answer is concatenation and minification. Now those are really just big words for saying we're going to smush things up and shrink them down as much as we can so that the browser doesn't have to load up a whole bunch of files. It can load up just a handful of larger files. Fortunately, there's a lot of plugins that do minification and concatenation already for WordPress. In this video, we'll just look at a couple that I found to be the easiest to set up. First, let's talk about Better WordPress Minify. You can find Better WordPress Minify just by going to the Plugins Add New screen on your WordPress dashboard and searching for Better WP Minify. Once you've installed it, which I already have on this particular site, and when you activate it, it automatically applies some default settings that should work for the majority of sites. So now that we've installed and activated Better WordPress Minify, let's take a look at our waterfall. You'll see that there aren't a whole bunch of different style sheets loading kind of in a stair-stepping pattern here. Rather, they've all been loaded up in one file, basically mushed together by Better WordPress Minify, so that the browser doesn't have to request 6, 10, 20 style sheets. Just one big file, or maybe two big files, and that's it. Notice our 1 second load time compared to 8 seconds earlier. That's not typical, but you can see big results when you do this. Now there are a couple of things you need to consider when you're doing minification and concatenation like this. The first thing is called parallelization. So we were talking about how browsers download multiple files at the same time. And it's actually to our advantage if we put our CSS into a number of files, maybe not one, maybe like four smaller files instead of one gigantic file. And the reason is that then our browser can download those 4 files at the same time without a significant overhead. It's when you get into the having 8, 10, 20, 30 files that the issue of browser limits on downloads starts to become a performance problem. Okay, so the first takeaway is we probably want to shoot for a sweet spot of about 4 CSS files and 4 JavaScript files. This really varies a lot depending on the site, but if you're anywhere in the 2 to 6 range, you're doing good. You can configure this on Better WordPress Minify by going to the plugin settings, and down here in this option, one Minify string will contain 10 files at most. If you play with this number, depending on how your site is set up and how many files that you have, that will determine the number of final output files that are there. Play with the number, see if you can get better or worse performance based on that. I would say it's probably much less important to worry about tweaking this than it is to simply make sure you're doing minification in the first place. Now, earlier we talked about how sometimes you'll visit a page and it's a white screen, or maybe half the page is loaded and then it spins and it waits for a long time. That is usually caused by slow loading JavaScript. Now, browsers have to wait for JavaScript to load up before they can do anything else on the page. To prevent that from happening on your site, the simplest thing to do is to put the JavaScript at the very end of your site. Most sites don't need the JavaScript to load right away. It can wait until the rest of the site is finished. To move JavaScript to the end of your site with Better WordPress Minify, you can go to Manage and Queued Files, and you can select all of the different JavaScript files and move them to the footer of the site. And after you save your changes, the JavaScript will be loaded at the very end of the page, basically. And we can verify that by looking at the page source. So if we look at the page source for this particular page and we scroll down to the bottom, you'll see right here near the bottom, it's loading up those JavaScript files that we told it to load at the very end. Now let's talk about some of the problems you might see when you're using concatenation and minification on your site. You'll notice here on my site, I have a big green header, and I added this in with a plugin using some JavaScript. Now that I've moved some JavaScript to the bottom of the site, if I refresh the page, my big green message goes away. That's not what I want it to be doing. And if I go to the Chrome Developer Tools and I just inspect this page, I'll see an error here. So let's just take a moment and talk about WordPress plugins for a second. There is no standard way to build a WordPress plugin, and while the majority of them kind of follow the rules of WordPress, some of them don't. Some of them do things in a very fragile way, a very particular way, and sometimes those plugins are really, really useful, but they're just fragile, so we kind of have to work around them. Thankfully, using Better WordPress Minify and some of these other plugins, it's not too difficult most of the time to solve these issues. So let's try to get our plugin working again. Coming back to the Managed and Queued Files page on our Better WordPress Minify settings, I can go to the script that is for our fragile plugin here, and I can select it and I say, don't minify it. And I can also select it and say, keep it in its original position. If I save this setting and I come back to my site, I'm going to refresh the page. I no longer see any errors in my console, which is great. And most importantly, my plugin is working again. So I would say if you start seeing problems with particular plugins and you can identify which ones aren't working, you don't even need to use the developer tools and look in the console for errors or anything like that. If you just notice something isn't working, go into the settings and see if you can disable that particular script or that particular style. Usually you can remove one or two and you'll still get 95% of the benefits of concatenation and minification. Just your site will still work, which is really, really the key here. Before we wrap this up, I'd like to mention one other plugin that makes concatenation and minification really easy. I'm going to go ahead and deactivate Better WordPress Minify and activate WP Rocket. WP Rocket is a caching plugin that does a whole bunch of different WordPress performance related stuff. The biggest difference between Better WordPress Minify and WP Rocket is that WP Rocket costs money. Whether you go with WP Rocket or Better WordPress Minify depends on your budget, depends on your site. Maybe one will work with your site and one won't. I recommend both. Better WordPress Minify is a little bit more of a focused tool, and WP Rocket is a all-inclusive performance plugin. So that's it. We're done talking about concatenation and minification. Please comment, rate, and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. Give me your feedback and let me know what else you want to know about.